Okay, and there we go.
Excellent. All right, so hello everyone. I'm Philip.
And I'm Ronnie.
And thank you, Lorianne, for the wonderful introduction. So today our talk will be about the bats of Jamaica with the scope of their natural history and their ecological importance. We're going to touch on the ongoing threats to them, but that's primarily going to be in part 2 of this series with John Flanders, who's going to be talking more about conservation. So be sure to be tuned in for that. So just to get started, a bit about me personally. I know that when you talk about bats in Jamaica, especially, how do you get started in bats? Why do you end up coming to Jamaica to study bats? And for me, not only do I go to the University of Toronto, I'm also from Toronto, which has a very strong connection to Jamaica, in our food and our culture and our sports. But I think the strongest sort of link, for me at least, is at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, where I grew up. I had my 5th birthday there. You can see me there in the Mickey Mouse sweater. We have the Bat Cave, which is molded off of the walls of St. Clair Cave in St. Catherine Parish, just outside of Ewerton. And it's a really impressive installation. It's been there since the 1980s with a recent revitalization. So here you can see the inside of our Bat Cave, which is modeled off of your Bat Cave. And probably the most important part of this is not just the rocks, but also the bats. So this started an early infatuation for bats with me, for me with bats, and ultimately was why I really wanted to travel to Jamaica to do this research. We were fortunate enough on our trip to visit St. Clair Cave, and I just wanted to give you guys a taste of what the emergence there looks like. You can hear a rooster in the background too.
Yeah, I don't know if the audio for these is going to come through or not, but mostly it's just us talking about what's going on.
Yeah,
and a lot of excitement about the bats.
Exactly. It's a really wonderful place. We had to hike up the Black River there, over river rocks. It was, tough walk, but really worthwhile. And it's an absolutely incredible place.
Yeah, it was amazing. Unlike anything else I've ever experienced. Unlike Phil, I don't have as deep and emotional and lifelong connection to bats or Jamaica in particular. I got started with bats only a few years ago, mostly doing computational work, and have been trying to get out and do more field work. So when Phil invited me along to come to Jamaica, I said yes, and it was one of the best decisions I've ever made.
You like the food too?
Yeah, the food was amazing. The people were amazing. The bats were amazing. It was incredible. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about what we can learn from bats and why we study bats, which to a lot of people seems like maybe a strange choice. But bats are the only flying mammal. They can live a really, really long time, especially for something as small as they are. So if you think about, rodents, mice, squirrels, things like that, they live, at most maybe 5 years. But there are bats that can live 40 years, 30 years, which is really bizarre. They eat all sorts of things. They're very disease resistant. And so they're a very good study animal if you have questions about immune function, evolution, ecology. Basically, any question you can ask about mammals, you can ask about bats. And there's a whole lot of bats to study. So I think we recently just crossed 1,460 known species. And this is a figure from a recent publication examining wild mammalian biomass. So basically how much mammals there are in the world. And so this green color, this sort of, not the darkest green, but the one stacked right on top of that, is bats. And so about 20% of all species of mammals are bats. About 60% of all biomass is bats. And the incredible part, 60% of all individuals, only about 6% of the biomass is bats, because they're so small, but there's also so many of them. So as you could see in that video of the cave emergence earlier, there's lots. They all emerge and swarm. And so if you can figure out how to catch them, there's a lot to learn.
So like Lorianne was saying, You guys call them rat bats. They're actually closer related to humans than they are to rats, but they do resemble them. But I just wanted to give you kind of a brief overview on how do we go out and catch rat bats, because it's more complicated than you think. So the two main modes of capture that we can use when catching bats are these devices called harp traps, which is here on the left. And as you can see, it's a sort of a frame structure with vertical fishing line that goes down into a bag. And then the other method is mist netting. So this is also a very common way to catch birds. And I'll talk about that one first. So yeah.
There you go.
Okay, so with mist nets, we set them up it's usually when you're set up in the forest or along a trail somewhere. You set them up in flight paths where you think that you're going to catch bats, and then bats will fly into them and get tangled in the threads. So you can see in this video, this is Cecilia. She's taking out an Artibius in Belize. If you could hear it, it is making a lot of noise. It is very angry. These bats can get very tangled. It can stress them out, and if you don't get them to them fast enough, they can continue to get themselves even more tangled. So this is a very sort of time-consuming affair. Harp traps, on the other hand, are really great for where we were. So in the bottom left here, you can see Ronnie and Damien and Brewster setting up a harp trap at the mouth of Windsor Cave. And they're really great for these places where you know that there are thousands of bats, hundreds of thousands of bats even. And what will happen is the bats will hit the vertical line, so you can watch in this video, and then fall down into the bag. So this is me just standing by the harp trap with our red light on, just so the bats couldn't see it that well. And you can see probably about 30 bats go into the harp trap in this video. And that night at Green Grotto, I think we caught probably close to 1,000
something like
animals. So you can get a lot of animals in a very short time. And when they're in the bag, they're totally happy. They're fine. Once we have them out of the net or out of the harp trap, the first thing there's Damien. First thing we do is we put them into a bag, and we label them with where we caught them, the time that we caught them at, and what we think they are as a presumptive ID. The next step is we identify the species with more detail. So here are two very similar Jamaican species. So we look at, for example, like the fur length, the color, the length of the forearm, things like that. We'll then assess them. So we'll look for the health of the wing. We can measure the forearm, again, just to see age. We can look at mass. We can collect hair samples. And we were also collecting wing punch samples using a biopsy tool. And that doesn't really hurt them. They're quite fine. And then they fly off looking happy. There's Ronnie with a Centurio in Costa Rica, and they're on their way into the night.
So now we want to talk a little bit about what makes the bats of Jamaica so special, why we came all the way from California and Canada to Jamaica to do this work. First of all, it's because Jamaica has a lot of really unique habitats, and it's in a really unique location. So this is a geological map of Jamaica from the Jamaican Caves Organization, and all of the red dots are known caves. There are also lots of unknown caves just throughout the landscape, especially in the regions that are really rich in limestone karst. Just due to the nature of that rock formation, it's very easy for caves to form, and you get these big caverns and tunnels, and the bats love that. Jamaica is also home to a lot of really good jungle habitat that the bats use for foraging. Jamaica is also situated in a really important location geographically, where it serves as sort of a migratory pathway for some North American and South American bats that come down through Florida, through Cuba, or in the case of some of these species, their ancient ancestors migrated up through the Lesser Antilles through Hispaniola and into Jamaica that way. And it's even thought that in times of lower sea levels, that the continental shelf around Nicaragua and Honduras would have formed almost an entire land bridge out to Jamaica. So because it's so centrally located, it serves as sort of a stopover place in evolutionary history for lots of different bats. And in terms of their ecological importance, as was mentioned in the introduction, They're very important seed dispersers for native fruits. So if you've ever seen large piles of droppings or almonds or fruit pith, that's probably the work of Artibius, which we'll talk about a little more detailed later. But there are also bats, 4 species in Jamaica, in fact, that feed on nectar like hummingbirds do, but they're active at night. So if you leave hummingbird feeders out and you find them lower in the morning than in the evening when you set them out, it was likely bats feeding at your hummingbird feeders. And so by feeding on these flowers, they serve to pollinate all of these plants and help native fruits both spread their seeds and actually pollinate the flowers and generate the seeds. On top of all of that, of course, bats are excellent insect predators, and in both agricultural areas, rural areas, and urban areas, bats are active at night, eating lots of bugs, keeping insect populations in check.
So I thought that sort of the best way to go through the natural history would be if we were to describe sort of who is who. What bats are you most commonly going to see, where are you going to see them, and what they're doing out in the bush and what they're doing for Jamaica. Just as a quick note, bat common names are typically very long and descriptive and generally trash.
Not very helpful.
Yeah, so we're going to stick to the scientific names, which are a bit more distinctive, and they do sound quite cool. So I don't think there's too much. You guys should be able to follow along. So Jamaica is real, as we mentioned, is very diverse for an island. There are members of 6 families of bats, 9 there of a possible 9 that you can find in the neotropics. So almost every family is represented. Most of these families are quite diverse, so Marmopidae, Phylostomidae, and Melocidae. And as you can see from the asterisks, those are all species that are endemic to Jamaica, so found nowhere else in the world. I'm going to start out talking about Noctilio. So this is Noctilio leperinus. They are the fishing bats or the bulldog bats. They feed on aquatic insects, small fish, crustaceans, things like that. There's even records, I believe, from Puerto Rico of Noctilio feeding on other bats. So they can be carnivorous as well. They're found throughout the neotropics, Central, South America, and most Caribbean islands. But for the most part, where they are found, other than flying over water courses, is poorly known. So in some places, we think that they're in termite mounds. If you've ever seen a big furry orange bat flying, out of somewhere, then please let us know, because it would be interesting to see where they go during the day. Yeah. Other cool things about them, so they have these humongous feet that they use to trawl the water and scoop up fish. They also smell quite bad because they do eat fish. So much like seabirds, they have that kind of terrible odor. And they do bite quite hard, but they're typically very docile when you're holding them. So Vesper tilionids. So these are typically the most common bat in most of the world. They're most typical, what you'd think of as something that looks like a rat bat. But in Jamaica, they are very poorly known. So there's only 2 species. These are not photos of those species. These are photos of bats that are very similar from Canada. So there's Aptesicus linei, which is at the bottom. It used to be the big brown bat, Aptesicus fuscus, and then Laziurus digletus, which is the Jamaican red bat. And this is a picture of the northern red bat. So that was the best I could do, because these bats are not very commonly seen. And in Jamaica, generally, we just don't know where they are and what they're doing. Like, there's only about 4 or 5 records of each of them. So Laziurus are typical in North America, at least. They're high flying. They fly near streetlights. They feed mostly on moths, and they're also migratory. And Aptesicus are more resistant to things like urban pressure, so they're very tolerant to light and noise. You can find them most often in houses. You can find them flying around Toronto. But Aptesicus linei, we don't know about them quite at all. Other bats we don't know a lot about are the natalids. So there's 2 species in Jamaica. One of them's endemic, the Natalis jamaicensis. So the Natalis jamaicensis is very, we really have no records of them. There are very few records. We think they're critically endangered. Chilonatalis, we were very fortunate to be able to capture at a place called Rock Spring in St. Mary. So that's me holding the Kyla natalis, and then this picture below is flying out of St. Clair Cave. And they really roost in high densities. So they're typically very abundant in caves where you find natalids, but they're very rarely captured because of the way they fly. They kind of fly like a hummingbird, like a butterfly. So they're very slow, very deliberate flyers. They'll fly right up to nets and traps and then fly right away. So that, you know, they like to tease you like that. And as a result, we really don't know a lot about their ecology, but they're really pretty. They have these beautiful funnel-eared bats. So funnel ears, their eyes are located right at the base of that funnel. And yeah, they're just really bizarre. More mupids. So these are the mustache bats. A lot of them look like they have a mustache. In Jamaica, there's 4 species. There's Mormoops blainvillei, which is the ghost-faced bat, or the real duppy bat. And then there's 3 species of Pteronotus. So there's Pteronotus parnelli, which is the largest, Pteronotus macleayi, which is sort of an intermediate size, and Pteronotus quadridens, which is the smallest. They're really tiny bats. They are all aerial hawkers, so they feed on flying insects, and they roost in very large numbers in caves. So these are mostly what we saw in that first video of the bats flying out of St. Clair Cave, primarily Pteronotus and Mormoops. Mormoops are really unique because they have audible echolocation to humans, so it's very low frequency.
For a bat, it's very high frequency for humans.
Yes,
but,
but if you're ever walking around the bush at night and you hear a sound that goes by your head, the sound kind of sounds like a lightsaber from Star Wars, like a woo 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 sound. That's probably a Mormoops, so you can actually hear them as they go by. The 3 species of Pteronotus separate what they eat through echolocation. So they echolocate at different frequencies, which makes them better at hunting particular insects. And that's actually from a study that was done at Windsor Cave that they figured that out. And Pteronotus parnelli in particular, so the largest one, which is an endemic now, is also extra special. These are the only bat in neotropics that are constant frequency echolocators. So they don't modulate their frequency. They always stay at the exact same one. And finally, for me, and then I'll turn it over to Ronnie, is the molossid. So these guys are kind of the emblematic sky puppy or sky shark. They fly around, they fly very high, very fast, and they're really efficient aerial insectivores. So there are 5 different species in Jamaica, again, because they're so high flying and they don't roost in caves. They're not typically observed, but you do get echolocation from them on acoustics. So we know they're there. But when they fly out of wherever they're roosting, so high up in a tree, high up on a cliff face, something like that, they're able to fill up on their insects in less than an hour. So you'll sometimes catch a molossid, like we've caught them in Costa Rica and Belize, and we'll look at it and think, oh, that's a pregnant female, until you notice that it is in fact a male.
it's just full of bugs.
Just very full.
Yes.
Yeah, and another just unique thing about them is they have this very sort of narrow wing aspect ratio, so they're very long and narrow with these elaborate tips, which enables that very quick flying. But the challenge with that is when we do capture them, they can't take off from your hand like most bats do. So we actually have to toss them up in the air in order for them to gain enough altitude for them to be able to take off and fly away into the night.
Yeah, they're really interesting in that way.
Yeah.
And they're very powerful flyers. Probably the most well-known molossid is the Brazilian free-tailed bat, which migrate from up into the US, well into the US, all the way down to Brazil. And they're present in Jamaica as well. So they cover huge distances every year on these yearly migrations. They're very strong flyers. And there are no endemic molossid's to Jamaica, probably because they can just fly away and come back and forth across Jamaica at different times of the year. So the phylostomids are the most diverse neotropical bat family. There are 7 species in Jamaica, 3 of which are endemic, which is really incredible. Almost half of the species in this family are endemic. These bats are going to be all of the frugivorous bats and nectarivorous bats that you'll encounter. One species present in Jamaica is primarily an insectivore, while the rest are either frugivorous or insectivorous. So to get started, this is the insectivore, Macrotus waterhousei. we were fortunate enough to be able to catch a handful of these guys while we were working in Jamaica. They're very easy to identify because of how large their ears are. And while this species isn't endemic to Jamaica in particular, it is only found in the Caribbean. So there are other closely related species in Mexico and South America, but not in Jamaica. And these guys are predominantly a gleaner. And so what that means is, unlike a lot of these other insectivorous bats that we've talked about that fly around in the sky and catch bats or catch bugs, these bats listen for insects making noise on leaves, so crickets, katydids, and things. And when they hear that, they can hone in on where that insect is calling from and go scoop them up. So they don't echolocate as much flying around. They are more of a sort of wait and listen predator. Artibius jamaicensis, named for Jamaica, is a very large fruit bat. This is one of the more abundant bats. They're not shy at all, and they tend to roost in little clusters. So you've probably seen these if you've seen bats around outside of caves. They roost in trees, they roost in houses. They really are hard to bother. They're very robust to disturbance. And they're friendly. They're usually pretty calm and soft. They feed on figs and other canopy fruits. They're very good seed dispersers, and they also are very powerful flyers and can fly a long way. So there are errant accounts from Florida. They're found in most of the Caribbean islands. They're found from Central America on down to Panama. So these are a fantastic bat to find. This is a Jamaican endemic frugivore. All of its close relatives are on different Caribbean islands. It's somewhat distantly related from the mainland species. So this is an old colonist of Jamaica. It's been there a really long time. It is relatively unknown. They're kind of hard to catch. We were able to catch one in the entire 2 weeks that we were there. And the site that we caught them, we know that there were more of them there. We caught a lot of fruit, but only 2 or 3 fruit bats. So they were hitting our harp trap with a mouthful of fruit and then dropping the fruit and then flying away, which was pretty cool because we got to see what they were eating, but we didn't get to catch any, really. So this is a really special and cool bat. And now we're moving into the nectar bats. So this is Glossophaga antillarum. This is relatively recently, within the last year, described as its own species. It has been previously considered only a subspecies, but they are substantially different from the ones that you catch in the Yucatan, which would be their closest relative. While most Glossophaga are primarily nectar feeders, and this one too is a nectar feeder, anecdotally, from people that we had talked to who've worked with these before, it seems that locally they feed on fruit more than nectar, which is very unusual for this species, or for the species in this genus. They seem to be found in lower numbers than the other nectar bats that we were catching, which is itself pretty curious. I also want to take a second just to look at this bat. So the scientific order for bats is Chiroptera, which means hand wing. And I think that this picture really does a good job of illustrating the fact that its wing is its hand, sort of cocked at an angle. You can see its thumb poking out, and then those are its fingers, which is unlike a bird wing, which is a whole arm. So anatomically, bats are really cool. Monophilus redmani is closely related to Glossophaga. It's also a nectar feeder. It's also predominantly a cave rooster. And to our surprise, it seemed like we were only catching males or only catching females at a lot of the sites we were catching. Sometimes we would find a bachelor cave. Sometimes we would find what is probably a maternity roost cave, but it's hard to say for sure. But we were definitely noticing a distinct pattern when it came to which we were catching at particular caves at a particular night. So these are another important pollinator. And the way the pollination works is that because they have such a hairy snout, when they put their nose into a flower to sip nectar, they just get pollen all over their face. And then when they move on to the next flower, they deposit some of that pollen, pick up some new pollen, and go on about their night. So when you catch these guys and some of these other nectar feeders coming home later into the night, they're usually just covered in pollen. They're just yellow with pollen. Aerophilus as a corny, also sometimes more yellow from pollen, but this bat tends to actually just have this yellowish color to it. They're yellowish orange. They're also very angry, usually, like notably very upset all the time. We caught tons of these. They're very, very abundant and very morphologically diverse. So these are all three the same bat, and you can tell that they all three look quite different. You know, a lot of differences in head shape and snout length, a lot of differences in fur color. Some of them tended to have white around their face, whereas others were just totally yellowish orange. And it's unclear if that's aging or just variability. But they're really cool. It was very cool to catch, you know, 500-600 of these in a night. And now the last but not least, Phyllonycteris aphylla is a critically endangered Jamaican endemic. Current estimates put their population at about 500 individuals. They had only been known from a single cave that is owned and managed by BCI and NEPA. So records from the past suggest that they are nectar and fruit feeders, that they're commonly found in a particular tree that blooms and has fruit at the same time, so that they might be utilizing that as sort of a one-stop shop to load up on nectar and fruit for the night. They're very similar in appearance to Aerophila. They're a lot paler. Their bones look pinker. You can see that in this picture a little bit, that the muscles on the forearm and the legs look pink, and they are a very pale color.
Mm-hmm.
And so here is a video of a Phyllonycteris right next to an Aerophila.
Hopefully the audio works.
Hopefully the audio works, but unclear.
Anyways, we were very fortunate to be able to catch Phyllonycteris at two sites where they previously, one where they were previously documented and one where we were the first people to catch bats at. So this was at the second site, and we just took advantage of having both bats together in order to take this video to try to make better designation for them, to figure out better ways to identify them. So fur length was one of the main things that we noticed with having both bats in hand. The Phyllonycteris are very short, and then the Aerophila are very sort of long and tawny fur. And then, like Ronnie was saying, the color of the forearms and the feet, it's very pink with the Phyllonycteris.
Yeah, in the video we're adjusting the lighting, trying to get it to come through on camera, and it's very obvious not on the camera, but on the camera, like we couldn't get it to show through. And you can tell here also that the Phyllonycteris on the left is very calm, and the Aerophila on the right is very, very upset.
Yeah.
It tends to be just generally a little bit crankier.
All right.
And do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So we're going to touch on this a bit, but like we mentioned off the top, part 2 of this talk will be with John Flanders from Bat Conservation International. So he'll be able to talk a lot more to the threats to bats in Jamaica and the conservation efforts that they're going through, and that NEPA and other government agencies are going through in order to help conserve bats. But the biggest sort of issues with bats in Jamaica come from the destruction of habitat. So if that's through bauxite mining or burning fields for agriculture, cutting bush, removing natural forest cover through whatever means is generally not good for any endemic animal, especially though those that rely on fruit and nectar. And then when it comes to the caves themselves, a lot of these caves are under threat, whether that's through people coming in to collect guano and burning a tire inside because they're afraid of the bats. Like we went to one cave where that had clearly happened and there were no bats using that chamber.
All, really.
Yeah. But then there's other places where a little bit of guano harvesting seems to be fine, and there's people seem to be using the caves, but there's still a lot of bats. It's a matter of the destructive practices trying to destroy the animals, and then also the disruption. So how often are people going in? How loud are the tools they're using? Things like that. And finally, feral cats are another big problem. There are a lot of cats around Jamaica. They kill a lot of birds, and when they find a cave, they'll kill a lot of bats too.
Yeah.
And that's especially a big problem for Phyllonycteris at Oh, which cave? Stony Hill Cave in Portland. That's why they're building walls and things. Anyways, that'll be in part 2.
Yeah, that's John's main focus.
Exactly. So with that, we have a lot of people to thank. I'll take guys and hosts, I guess. So Damien, you can see him under the harp trap. He's the hardest working guy in Jamaica. Susan at the Windsor Research Center, Stefan for the JCO, and Yan and Sylvia. Jamaican Caves organization is great. And then also other support people like Dango and Sugar Belly.
Yeah. And then our contacts at NEPA who have been very helpful, Andrea Donaldson and Samantha Grant have been great. Our advisors, Ken Welch is Phil's advisor and Betsy Dumont is my advisor, as well as our funding sources, folks that lent us equipment to come make this trip possible,
And
like Nancy and Hugh.
And all the photos.
And all of the
that
photos
you saw that weren't ours, the credits are below. So
yes.
Thank you to everybody.
Also, just this picture is Damien's legs sticking out from under a harp trap. There was a boa, an endemic boa, the Jamaican yellow boa, was hanging over a cave entrance at dusk. And Damien laid on the ground trying to get footage of it for an hour or two.
And he got covered in bat piss.
Yeah, absolutely covered. And but he did get some very good footage of the snake catching a bat. So check out Damien's Twitter if you want to see that. But with that, I think we're done and we'll take any questions. Thank you guys so much. Okay. I can go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Wow. That was quite a bit of information.
Yeah.
Really condensing into a short presentation. Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor now to questions. There is one in the chat already. Is the resemblance between bats and rats a result of convergent evolution?
I think in a sense, possibly. But I think that when you hold and handle bats up close, most of them don't look too mousy. Most of them look like mammals. I think that we're used to seeing ourselves as sort of big and hairless and seem to see things that are different from us as all more similar to each other. But when you really get to know the animals a lot, they are quite different. They're small and furry and cute. But beyond that, there I think are a lot of differences.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. What are you suggesting be done about the feral cat?
I think that's a bit above our pay grade.
Yeah, that again is mostly John's thing. Feral cats are a big problem everywhere that there are people with cats. It is an unfortunate side effect of bringing animals that humans like to places that humans and those animals were not before. Cats are pretty destructive, even here in the States, and I'm sure in Canada as well. That it's not a unique issue to Jamaica. Feral cats they kill a lot of important endemic species everywhere.
Yeah, like things like sterilization campaigns could help culls, but nobody really likes to talk about that. It generally, if you own a cat, keeping it indoors is the best thing to do. Cats, I believe, are responsible for something like 2 billion bird deaths a year.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, generally owning a cat, great indoor pet. Don't let them outside.
Yeah.
Okay, there is another question. In the city setting, repeat which bats would be depositing almonds and eating the soft skin fruits like mangoes, sweetsup, and custard apples? Thanks.
So the two main culprits, if you see a lot of fruit debris, are going to be Artibius jamaicensis and Iridius flavescens. And I know that we said that the common names aren't very helpful, but in this case, Artibius is the Jamaican fruit bat, and then Iridius is the Jamaican fig-eating bat, which is, I guess, fairly self-evident. But they both eat figs. They're both in Jamaica, so the names aren't particularly useful for telling them apart, I don't think. But Probably in a more urban setting, it's going to be Artibius jamaicensis, the Jamaican fruit bat, because they tend to be less shy. It's possible that some of the nectar feeders might be consuming some smaller fruits around, but probably not mangoes or custard apples or things that are that big.
Yeah, like when we were at Riverhead Cave in St. Catherine, that was where we were getting rained on by bats hitting the traps and then dropping fruit. And I think we identified that they had naseberry and a couple of different types of fig. So,
and something else that we couldn't figure out.
yes.
Okay. There's another question. Will there be any educational workshops for the public? It may help with the fare of the animal.
That's something that we had talked to Damien about. It's something that we would love to do that kind of work. You know, I think that there is a lot of misunderstanding and misperception about bats. And, you know, I think that a lot of people are afraid of what they don't know and what they don't understand.
Yeah.
Especially bats have a long history of superstition in many cultures throughout the world. And I think that part of doing good science and good science communication is trying to help sort of recontextualize that folklore, not forsaking it, but just understanding, you know, what's myth and what's real, you know, to cultivate a healthy respect and support these animals.
I think sort of what's on the docket for our next visit to Jamaica. We were talking again with Damien White Rooster about doing potentially a field course with UWI. Hopefully we'd be able to visit some schools. I think that that's kind of the place where we would be able to make the biggest difference. But you know, I'd like to be able to come back and there'd be a whole generation of Jamaican bat biologists, you know.
That's the dream.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure, Philip. Okay. Damani has his hand up. Go ahead, Damani.
Good evening, everyone. Great presentation, guys. I wanted to add a little bit of anecdotal information from the work that we've been doing here with the bats. Glossophaga, the long-tongued bat, actually pretty. You mentioned you didn't find it that much. It's actually pretty prevalent in suburban and urban areas. Really? So I live right in Kingston. It's not, live actually in New Kingston, which is not near any forest. And Glossophaga has flown into my house and gotten lost. I had to get them out.
Really? Okay. Good to know.
They feed on, like that photo, if you have a banana or a plantain tree, that's the bat that you see coming and going from the flower. And I've been to a house, again, just here in Kingston, this one closer to some sort of forest, a house in Beverly Hills, to assess a situation where someone had a structure which is, it's on a hill, so they have a pool deck. So one side of the pool deck is, there's an overhang, you know, that to build support. And then underneath this area, for all of the, I guess, pump access and all of that, there was Glossophaga using this very, this man-made pseudo cave.
Really awesome.
Right? This man-made pseudo cave. I actually have some video of it. And another instance in St. Mary, an abandoned hotel. All of the hallway is covered in Glossophaga. It's the only bat in there. So it's actually the only bat outside of Artibius that I've seen just utilize man-made structures like that. The mollusks, like the free-tailed molossus and the free-tailed bat, those are all in roofs all the time.
Right.
They're in, right. But in terms of, it's only Artibius using like high gazebos or any high roof. and then Glossophaga in these are very abandoned buildings in the open spaces. So it's interesting because that's the nectar feeding bat that you sort of come across the most when not looking.
Yeah, no, I think that that's the main thing too with the two Vesper bats in Jamaica is that we sort of carry forward doing what we've usually done as scientists. And so we put harp traps in front of caves and we put mist nets in the woods. And, you know, I think that there's a lot that we don't see because we don't know how to look for it. You know, and I don't know if anybody would be super interested in us sticking a harp trap by their pool. But you know, trying to figure out ways to access some of those more urban bats or high flying bats, things like that, is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Yeah.
Okay, great. There's a comment by Cecile in the chat. Adapt or die, the bats have.
They've been very good and very successful at that throughout their evolutionary history.
Yeah.
Bats, I think bats start in the fossil record 62 million years ago.
Something like that. They've been around a long time.
Yeah, they sort of just appear as a fully formed bat. There's a really cool fossil. It's actually at the Royal Ontario Museum, which is the earliest bat fossil that's known. Encourage you to check it out, Google it. It's very cool.
Okay, there's another question. Which is the largest bat?
So the largest bat, I believe, it's one of the flying foxes.
Golden crowned flying fox.
Golden crowned flying fox. It's found in Southeast Asia.
I think it's just the Philippines.
Just the Philippines?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's
a bunch.
Something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they're huge. They're like as big as an eagle. They have like a 4 or 5 foot wingspan. So what? You know, 1.5 meter wingspan. Yeah. Probably. But they're not in Jamaica. The biggest bat in Jamaica is probably Artibius.
Probably Artibius. Yeah.
Probably Artibius. They're hefty.
Yeah. Certainly by mass.
Yeah.
Across the neotropics, it's actually Vampirum spectrum. They're the spectral bat, and they are very large. They're like the jaguars of the air.
Yeah, they have about a 3/4 of a meter.
Yeah. We don't get them so big in the Americas, but
yeah, they're generally smaller bats here.
Yeah.
I also don't do meters, so I'm sorry.
Freedom units only.
Freedom units only.
Okay, thank you. There's a comment from Damien. He says, "Good job, guys."
All right.
Glad to see you here, Damien.
Yeah. In and out a couple of times.
Yes, I think he's probably having connectivity issues. Okay, Lisa has a question. Would bats make their home in an outdoor open bamboo shower area? Is it their droppings I find each morning?
It's at least possibly bat droppings. They're probably not roosting there during the day. So bats have two sort of kinds of roosting behaviors. There's where they hunker down during the day and sleep. But then in the night while they're active, they're not flying around all night for 12 hours of the night. They go out, they forage, they probably find places to socialize and eat or just hang out. We know that they tend to be very social. So what you might have on your hands is a night roost, where the bats might be coming at night to eat and hang out in sort of a safe, partially enclosed area, but probably not a place where they're living during the day, especially if it's open and exposed, where it would get direct open sunlight.
Okay, Damani says he calls it the bat bar.
It's a good name.
Okay, what time of night would Artibius be out eating?
They start foraging pretty much at sunset, and throughout the night, so bats, like we were just saying, they do go through these sort of, will go out, forage for a bit, maybe post up at a night roost to socialize. It's a lot like what we might do during a day. So they're not constantly foraging. There might be some social interaction time, mating, exploring, things like that. But typically they'll probably go to trees that they know, night roosts that they know, go back to the same places around the same times of night.
Yeah.
But it would really depend on the individual.
And the location.
Yeah.
We were out to eat at a patio deck in Montego, I think.
Ochi.
It was Ochi.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there was some sea almond trees around, and there was an Artibius banging around in the trees while we were having dinner at 8:30 or something.
Yeah.
And the workers there said that yes, there's usually bats around. We were excited. They were mostly frustrated.
I have a question. What do you find to be the most curious social behavior or habit of the Jamaican bats you've encountered?
Ooh. That's. I think that there's something to be said about the emergence order that we saw in a lot of places. So when we did have the harp trap set up in front of caves, you'd often go through sort of waves, where we had, a lot of bats come out all at once, and they were all Pteronotus or Mormoops, so they were all the mustache bats. And then there was a bit of a break, and then you'd have another big rush of bats, and they would be all Aerophila, or Monophilus, or any of those. And then, we'd sit there, process them for a while, and come back, and it'd be totally full again with another species. So it was this sort of progressive exit from the cave and re-entry. There's probably a lot going on that we just don't have the capacity to understand. Like
it does seem like they have it all worked out, because it would be probably dangerous for them if they all tried to leave at once, right? It would create what is essentially a huge traffic jam at the mouth of a cave. So they somehow have it worked out amongst themselves, that they come out at certain times all together with their friends, and then go out, and then the next species comes out and leaves.
It's also kind of this cross-species interaction thing that's really bizarre, that to my knowledge no other animals do, where you have a bunch of different species that seem to interact with each other and might have some way of communicating with each other.
I think that interspecific interactions happen. Like there are a lot of, I think, birds that sort of interact with one another, and we interact with other animals as well. But the fact that they all live together in such close quarters in mixed species, and from some conversations with other researchers, it seems like they have preferences with what species they want to roost with. Some bat species will not roost with other bat species, but some are okay. So they sort of have their social preferences when it comes to who they are literally hanging with in the cave.
Some decide who the cool kids are, and they stick with them.
Yeah, they have their cliques just like us.
Okay, Damani says he has noticed what you mentioned about the emergence patterns, especially during mass insect emergence.
Yeah, I believe that, especially in those caves that are just stuffed full of the 3 different Pteronotus.
Yeah, and I saw Damien mention something too about foraging with swallows at dusk.
Yes, he's asking if you have noticed bats foraging with birds, for example, swifts and swallows in the evening. He has noticed that a lot.
I remember when we were at Green Grotto, I think it was, with Damien, that was happening a little bit. And here in my yard, I have a pond in my yard, and there's a little bit of an overlap between when the swallows are still out feeding and when the earliest bats start to emerge. Here, it's not as much, I don't think, but there is a little bit of overlap where they seem to be foraging in the same place at the same time.
Yeah, I think Riverhead too. There was also a lot of cave swallows and a lot of bats that were coming in and out all at the same time.
Okay, another question from Damien. Have you guys worked in any country where the majority of locals actually love bats?
I think Canada, we're working towards more people being aware of bats, and especially because we've had white nose syndrome rip through the eastern part of the country. where most of our bats have died. So a lot of our species are now endangered because of this disease. So there's been a big push to make people aware of bats. I wouldn't say the majority of locals love the bats, but
No.
they're certainly more aware.
Yeah, the bat on the Bacardi label. In Mexico, I think we haven't worked in Mexico, but I know that there's been a lot of work done to sort of rehabilitate the perception of bats in Mexico. And I think mostly what we get met with is confusion when we tell people what we do. Because
I'd say even in places like Costa
That's true.
Rica, where there's a very big appreciation of the natural environment, like most of their economy now is based around nature and nature tourism. It's still, you ask somebody about bats and they kind of give you a confused look. Like,
Yeah.
why are you looking for that?
And I guess these things come out at night. So
Right.
in your day-to-day life, are you really going to encounter a bat face to face? You may see signs of a bat having been around, but will you really encounter one staring you in the face?
Right. Yeah.
It's probably
also
seen as
very
something
different.
cryptic.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, it's also very different when you do see a bat out in nature roosting high on a building or high in a tree. You can't really get a sense of it. So it is very special and very different when someone has a bat in hand in front of you, and you can see, just how soft it is, and you could touch the wing, and you can. It becomes a much more tactile thing when you can actually see what the animal is rather than something far away and high up in a dark place.
Okay, so Damian has his hand up. Damian, go ahead.
Yeah, just a comment. A while ago I was like at Dr. Garway's house, and there's a lot of Artibius. Those are the fruit bats that came to what we call what's that thing? Fig tree. No, not a fig tree. Darn, I can't remember the tree, but they come there to feed, and it's normally so difficult to pick them up with acoustics because they're so quiet. They use more their eyesight and stuff like that. So just wanted to put that comment. But to you, this is the Natural History Society, and I was just asking you guys, since you have visited different countries, how do you get naturalists involved in doing bat stuff? I mean, what if I don't have any fancy acoustic tool, if I can't use a harp trap, how do you get us started? How does one start?
That's a difficult problem, especially because there is some amount of difficulty with access, right? So I think that trying to ID these bats without holding them is very hard. Like the best you can do is acoustics, and even basic acoustic equipment can be expensive. With all people who want to get into learning animal identification type stuff, you could set up game cameras, but that doesn't really work as well with bats because they're very fast and it's at night. You can set up echo meters, but those are really expensive too.
Yeah.
I think in general, unless you're trained, it's a bad idea to go out and grab animals.
Yeah, especially bats,
especially
which carry
bats.
a lot of disease, including rabies and things.
Yeah, so it is really hard. I think that something that you can do, and it's something that I had done, granted, I grew up in a place where this was a little more possible. I grew up near Austin, and someone mentioned in the comments that there's a huge colony that lives in Austin. So I had seen some bat emergences as a kid. And here where I live now, if I walk out at dusk, I can see the bats at work. And so if it's true that they're in Kingston, if they're in urban areas, then, if you want to get involved, find a place where there's flowers that they like and go at night. Or if you've got a backyard, hang up a hummingbird feeder and put a little camera by it and see if anything comes to it at night. And that's a way that you can get started without a huge cost burden or skill burden. You're not going to see all of the bats that way. I mean, even with all that we do, we don't get to see all of the bats, so it's a particularly tricky, I think, study animal.
Yeah, one of the ways that, you know, we hope to, when we do come back, is, you know, we'll hopefully visit some schools, take some animals, live animals, to visit the schools. But going to watch an emergence, that would probably be the best thing to do. And there are, like we said,
There are
you know,
places
so
where
many
you can do
caves
that,
and
yeah.
so many excellent places. Maybe easier to get to than St. Clair, but not too bad.
Yeah, and just to finish up the comment, one of the things that I think us as naturalists can do, there are a number of places that have emergence, that some of these caves are not on the JCO. And just by making notes where you see bats flying out, I know you explain what a flight pattern is.
Mhm.
That's good information for us to start. I mean, we don't have, I mean, here, and I'm glad that you mentioned this in the natural history and we put it in our notes. If you're home and you see a bat feeding on a sweet sap tree, you can just record that the bats ate the sweet sap tree, and all of that observation will go to a database where another scientist looking at what bats eat. So I mean, any other information that can be given. And the tree was trumpet tree. Dr. Gary just put it in.
Oh, interesting.
Thank
Oh,
you
that-
very much. Yeah.
I wonder what that is.
Cecropia.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Yeah.
The Artibius love it and
Love
Artibius
Cecropia.
flavors it.
Yes.
Right. But there's a lot of information that people give, are like bats sleeping in the yam foliage, which is very important. So I just mentioned it here to naturalists. Any observation, just share it. Last question in that. The night Antillean nighthawk, do they echolocate? We have a lot of them flying with the bats. The nighthawks that go chip, 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 chip.
They might be basic echolocators. I think that the only bird that has
Oil birds, right?
yeah, oil birds
Yeah.
are basically blind, and they echolocate. But I think that even they don't have the sort of sophisticated echolocation that bats do, where they're actually creating sort of visual maps with
Yeah.
sound.
At least the New World bats, and like
Right,
the
they
termites.
don't echolocate.
Well, some of them do, but it's a re-evolved tongue-clicking form of echolocation.
Which
That's
people can
super
do
weird.
also,
Yeah.
which is something that I learned a few years ago that I think is very fascinating. But people can learn to do basic echolocation. You know, again, you're not going to chase an insect down and catch it, but you can tell where walls and things are.
Okay, thanks, Damian. Anne says in Austin, Texas, bat emergencies are that's emergencies, not emergencies, like something critical, are a big thing at a huge colony in the town.
Yeah, we were there for a bat conference in last summer.
last
And
summer.
basically every night there was a large group of bat researchers that walked down to the bridge to see them, and there were also just a bunch of other people
Yeah,
there, normal people, you might say,
yeah.
that went to see the bat.
Tourists and
Yeah,
citizens,
yeah,
not
Not
scientists.
crazy bat people.
Right.
Batty bat people.
Yeah. Fancy.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that they tend to be disease resistant. Is there any reason for that? And I would also want to tack on to that. What do you think about the bad rap they tend to get in terms of these being a reservoir for these new diseases and viruses and that cause diseases that we are experiencing more and more in recent times? Not just bats, but bats have been highlighted in the media.
Right.
So I'll start with the last part of the question. I think that anytime there's interaction with humans and nature, it can go to one of two ways. You can either, you know, experience nature in its element, or you can start to invade it and take away elements of the natural environment, and then things start to spill over. So that's more when things start to go bad. These bats, what truth is, you know, these bats are reservoirs for a lot of different viruses. But we hadn't known that for many, many years because we weren't interacting with them. So there are good passive ways where you can interact with bats by going out and watching emergences and doing acoustics. The way that we handle bats is done very safely. We were always wearing gloves. We're always wearing masks. But when people, go into caves in a destructive capacity, or when, they're killing bats for bushmeat or things like that, that's when we end up with this spillover effect.
Right.
Do you want to talk about the capacity, their sort of
Yeah.
parallel capacity
So
things?
so there's a lot of really cool research being done on bat disease ecology. A lot of it is very technical and over my head because I'm not a disease biologist. But from what I understand, the current theory is that it sort of goes hand in hand with why they live such a long time, which is that they have a drastically reduced inflammation response. So when you get sick or when you get cut, your body uses inflammation as a way to heal and stop further infection. But it sort of cuts both ways, because that same inflammation response can also cause tissue damage. It causes the problems that you have when you have a high fever, things like that. Bats, because they are incredibly active and have incredibly high metabolisms, seem to have evolved a reduced inflammation response due to their lifestyle, and that allows them to be sick without sort of compromising their health as much, which sounds strange, that sort of the things that we as mammals have that protect us can also hurt us, and that by sort of turning that response down, bats have found a way to beat these diseases that are so problematic when they spill over into humans. And in terms of sort of talking a bit about the sort of like the bad reputation, I think that a lot of it is driven by not quite fully understanding what's going on. A lot of it is driven by encroachment and habitat destruction. Something that we had experienced in Belize is that there was a rabies outbreak in cattle. And so people were very mad about that. And they went to the vampire caves and burned out the caves to get the vampires to leave. Well, that sounds good on paper, maybe, but what actually happens is that you just took the vampires where you know where they all are, and you know that they're sick, and you just sent them out everywhere and made the problem a lot worse, because now they don't have a home. They're flying around looking for other places to live, and you've caused like a dispersion event of that. So I think that people act a little too eagerly when it comes to trying to control this. But it is a very complicated and nuanced issue, because there are human health concerns involved, that it gets tricky. And I think that, the best thing that we can do as naturalists and as everyday citizens is just try to respect nature and engage in it in ways that don't put you or nature at risk. And yeah, superstition, I think, also drives the fear in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Keeping in line just with that, the disease that you mentioned that is decimating bat populations in Canada, is it one that a human could transfer from one bat to another by handling?
So yes, white nose syndrome is a fungal pathogen. It came over from Europe from someone that went into a cave. So somebody went into a cave in Europe, they got fungus on their boots or on their tools, and then went into a cave somewhere in upstate New York and set off this entire sort of epidemic across North America. It really only affects bats when they hibernate, so they can go for a long time with the spores on them or on the cave walls and things. And then when they hibernate, the fungus propagates at a temperature of about like 1 to 3 degrees Celsius. So that's perfect temperature for hibernation and perfect temperature for the fungus. And it grows on them, it wakes them up, it reduces their fat stores, and they essentially starve over winter. So we used equipment that was never used in areas with white nose syndrome in Jamaica. We used equipment that we only use in the tropics for that reason, because there is the capacity for us to pass that on. I don't know if it would affect any bats in Jamaica because they don't hibernate, but I don't want to take that risk, obviously.
Well, that's interesting, because it means then that as human beings, we think of wildlife infecting us, but we also have the propensity to do the reverse And so
Absolutely.
we can cause damage to them as well.
Absolutely.
I never thought of it from that standpoint. Thanks for that.
Mhm.
Another question. Do bats have rabies?
They can, yes.
Yes.
Not all bats have rabies. In fact, probably very few actually do have rabies because the form of rabies that they get is a paralytic form. So they don't aggressively go around biting. They actually become paralyzed and they die. But it does exist in bats. We are fully rabies vaccinated. We handle all bats while wearing gloves. We have our rabies titer check. Anytime anyone handles a bat, you should always have your rabies shots. And if you don't, and you get bit by a bat, you should go get some rabies shots.
Yes.
Because you don't want to mess around with rabies.
Yes. And so there's this sort of, I think, perception that bats are this primary rabies vector, at least in the States, because so many animals that are found test positive for rabies. But the trick is that they are there's just a lot of bats. So if like a remarkably low percentage of bats have rabies, then that still looks like a lot of animals possibly. Another thing is that you don't find the healthy bats. You only encounter the sick bats. So if you find a bat that is injured or sick, you know, normally if you walked into a cave, most of those bats are healthy and going about their life. But when you encounter downed bats, sick bats, those bats are likely sick bats. So there is sort of this misperception due to humans being inherently bad statisticians that leads a lot of people to think that there is this huge risk. And while the risk is there and should be taken seriously, I don't think that it's cause for undue action. Also, yes, as Damani said, in the US, foxes and raccoons actually have really, really high prevalences of rabies. So there are fewer raccoons in total in the US than there are bats in some caves, which is crazy to think about. That like one cave of bats is more animals than all of the raccoons.
Yeah.
But something like, I don't know, like 5% of raccoons, 10% of raccoons have rabies, whereas a fraction of a percent of bats have rabies. So like dogs, cats, mongooses, things like that are also very high risk. And if you get bit by a feral dog, you should, you know, go to a doctor for that.
Okay. And you did mention earlier in the presentation, you have that graphic about the percentage of mammals that actually are bats and just how many we have in terms of population. The numbers is crazy. And they're so tiny because then you said their weight is a mere fraction, really.
Right.
Yeah, I think at St. Clair Cave, you know, there's probably tens of thousands, if not 100,000 bats that pour out of there every night from the three entrances. There's also, you know, we caught probably about 1,000 bats at Green Grotto, which was a fraction of the total population. So there are an astonishing number of individuals.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here. Is there any evidence of rabies in Jamaica? And also, is there any evidence that migratory bats come to Jamaica? I would say perhaps even do some of the bats here leave Jamaica?
So there is no confirmed rabies in Jamaica. That is possibly a dangerous way to look at the situation, because we do know that these bats are migratory. We do know that they can be very far flying. As I said, Artibius jamaicensis is found in Florida, where there's certainly rabies. It's found on the Caribbean islands that do have rabies, and it's found in Jamaica. And there's no real way to know if they're going somewhere else, getting rabies, and then bringing it back to Jamaica.
Yeah.
This is something that we've talked about a fair amount, actually. There was a recent study that looked at the sort of known flight distances of bat species in Jamaica, and it looked at how close we know rabies is in bats. and assessed the risk of possible rabies in Jamaica. But because there are no vampire bats in Jamaica, the bats aren't likely spreading it to things that aren't bats. So
Yeah.
you don't have spillover events because, you know, a fruit bat isn't going to attack a dog, for instance. And it's really only going to bite a person that picks up a sick bat. And that, in a sense, is a way that maybe the, you know, the superstition of Jamaicans has protected them because they're not going into these caves and picking up sick bats. So I think that it is an unknown. And I think that it is a very serious unknown because the consequences of being wrong are fatal. So
Like we said, don't mess around with rabies.
so, you know, in short, there is no evidence of rabies in Jamaica, but there are lots of ways that there could be rabies in Jamaica and we wouldn't know it.
Yeah. The United Kingdom thought that they were rabies free until about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I got
And-
bit by a bat.
Yeah, then a guy got bit by a bat, and then it very quickly changed the way they approached it.
Yeah, he thought that there was no rabies in the UK because there was no confirmed rabies in the UK. And so he got bit by a bat handling a bat, didn't have a previous rabies vaccine, didn't go to a hospital to get a vaccine, and then became the first person to die of rabies in the UK. So,
Yeah.
you know, I don't want that for anyone. And so I would encourage caution.
Yeah, certainly if you're planning on handling bats, rabies vaccines would be a good idea.
Well, I think our laws would actually preclude persons from handling the wildlife. So if persons bear that in mind, then they should be okay.
Yeah,
There was a question, is bat manure good for fruit trees?
depends on the bat.
Yes.
So fruit
Oh.
bat manure is not so good. It's mostly, what is it? It's nitrogen poor? Is
It's
that-
nitrogen poor.
Yeah, okay. But the insectivorous bats, so the Pteronotus, and mormoops and things like that,
Mhm.
if there's big piles of that guano, that's actually very good fertilizer.
Yes.
But how would we know the difference in the bat dropping?
So when it's just like a big pile of guano in a cave, I don't know that you could tell. But if you just see droppings, a lot of these seed dispersers are going to have seeds in their fecal matter. And a lot of the insectivores, you'll see bug parts possibly in the fecal matter. So that's one way to know. Beyond that, you know, in our experience, nectar feeding bats do not have solid waste because they are on a mostly liquid
Yeah.
diet. So you will probably never see, you know, Glossophaga poop.
Other than maybe a splatter or
Yeah.
something. Yeah. But yeah, like Damien said, the bats in housetops, churches, and other man-made structures are good for manure. They're almost always going to be those molluskids, or maybe even Aptesicus. You never know. But they're bug-eating bats, and yeah, probably pretty good.
So, you know, a natural way that you can encourage bat deposits is if you put up bat boxes around your cropland or something like that, then you'll encourage both pest control of your cropland and, you know, get a natural dose of bat droppings over whatever you're growing.
Okay, thanks for that. Did we answer the second part of Anne's question? She was asking if there was evidence of migratory bats coming to Jamaica.
I think I touched on that. There is definitely evidence, I think, of bats that leave Jamaica and bats that enter Jamaica.
Okay.
Gene flow.
There's at
Yeah.
least gene flow on, you know, the scale of hundreds of years. I don't
Okay.
know that we could detect gene flow on scales much shorter than that,
No.
but you know, they're probably they could hitch rides on boats if they don't want to fly. We know that there's confirmed records of Cuban endemic bats in Belize after hurricanes. So hurricanes are a way that, you know, a bat that's caught in the storm is just going to get thrown across the ocean. And if they land on your island, then they're there now.
Okay. Lisa is asking, can bats carry poison from chemical fertilizer?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. Was your lab mate the one who was doing that research?
Natalia, yeah, she was looking at neurotoxic chemical pesticides that are used throughout Latin America, and it was getting into the bats. So through the insects, through spraying, it definitely gets into the bats. They can also accumulate things like mercury. They're just like any other animal where there is a spillover whenever you use something toxic on the land.
Okay, thank you. Can you repeat the suggestion for encouraging bats over farmland?
If you want to put up a bat box, they look great. They're very unobtrusive. There's no guarantee that the bats will use your bat boxes, but they can if they're in the right place and the right height. They are very good roosts for bats, and they love them. They'll go in there, they'll shit all over the ground.
Yeah, they would do that.
And you'll definitely be able to tell if you have bats in them.
Yeah.
As far as how do you make one or where do you get one, there are a lot of schematics online. You can just Google bat box blueprint or something like that. There's a few different types. There's a rocket shaped box. There's multiple panels. They're quite cheap to make if you don't know how to do some woodworking. There are companies that sell them. I think Bat B&B is the biggest one.
Yeah, I think so.
But yeah, it's quite easy to make yourself. You can just do it with a few pieces of wood.
Okay, there's a suggestion here that there is some interest in using bat guano for organic ganja, but
Yeah.
that guano harvested from bat caves should be strongly discouraged from the caves themselves because of the disturbance and the risk of introducing invasives such as cockroaches.
For sure.
And also perhaps what you mentioned before of introducing pathogens into their ecosystem that may not have been there from our presence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a responsible way to go about it. The typical sort of guano harvester seems to be a little afraid of the bats and will light fires to smoke them out and then come in and harvest, and that's definitely not a responsible way. Anytime you go into a cave, there's obviously risk. And I think that using some elements of bat guano for ganja farming is okay. It's just a matter of, are you collecting it ethically? Are you being considerate of the animals and the space? Going in with clean boots is a good thing. Coming out and not disturbing the bats is obviously also a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question. How is climate change affecting bats? We're having a drought in Jamaica and we know that they drink from ponds.
Yeah, certainly some bats will be, well, all bats will be affected by the drought. Do you want to take this one?
Sure. Climate change is impacting everything really. And different species have different amount of resistance to that. Can they move somewhere else? Can they change what they eat? Are they obligate drinkers, or can they get their water from what they eat? So it's possible that a lot of these nectar feeders or fruit feeders are able to get all the moisture that they need from eating fruits, sipping from flowers. But if there are species that are reliant on fresh surface water, then that's where things like drought are going to be really impactful. Also, things that pollute the water table are going to be really impactful, whether it's fertilizers, mining runoff, construction project runoff, but that is something that's also not limited just to bats. That's something that's impacting everything currently. So yeah, I don't know that they're any more or less impacted than other organisms. Some of them might be benefiting, especially a lot possibly of the tropical species might see range expansions, especially if they don't really care what they're eating. Then they can continue to move northward and expand their habitat. But some things that are incredibly specialized, maybe they only eat a couple of different tree species fruit. And if the habitat for those trees changes and those trees no longer grow, then that bat or that animal no longer has any food left. So resistance to climate change is a really fascinating avenue for study, and it's going to be really important for our planet going forward to try to understand what we can do to remediate a lot of the damage that is coming down the line.
Okay, thank you. Damien has his hand up. Damien, go ahead.
Yeah, it was just a quick question back to you. In terms of what they were talking about with the ganja farmers, there's a number of questions coming now. A number of the farmers who are growing what they call it again, green, it's not green, organic ganja. And a notion going around, I've seen it where they said the drop-in for Artibius jamaicensis, they are looking for it. So even though the papers say that it doesn't have enough, what I should say, it doesn't have enough elements compared to the insectivores, it is being pushed. So a number of the ganja farmers, I don't know how you can bring out that information, that is good, but they are looking for areas with that have Artibius jamaicensis. And last comment in regards to what you were mentioning in the caves. So one of the practices to burn the tire. Another practice is to get the pepper. They go to like Coronation Market and they buy the hot pepper.
Yeah.
That is being spoiled, that is spoiling. And then they go to the cave, and you know when you're burning pepper, it burn your eyes.
Yeah.
So they burn that amount in the cave, and it's supposed to scare the bats out.
Yeah.
I'm sure it does.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you know, we don't know the impact that it's having because that pepper extract is pretty strong.
Right.
And there is not enough evidence on it. Last comment to mention in it, we also do acoustic study in Jamaica, but we haven't, the acoustic so far has picked up only 12 of the 21. The farthest some of this, sorry, let me break it down. They like Artibius jamaicensis, Artibius flavensis, and those group. If you're not over where they're feeding, or even when you see them feeding as early in the, just at sunset, you see them coming out the trees and feeding. Even when you have a good, because right now I have about 4 different acoustic detectors. I use the Anabat Walk, I use the Audiomat, I use the other one from that you introduced to me, Ronnie. I forgot that one. About
the echometer. The echo
right, the echometer. All of them work, but you have to be in very close proximity.
Right.
So I mean, the challenge is I don't touch the bats because I don't have my ribbon shots. I do mostly acoustics. But
Right.
I don't pick up most of the groups like you guys, and we're still having problems with the library. But just want to say
is a huge barrier.
thank you guys for the work that you have done. We need more researchers like you, and we also need the naturalists that are here to share observation.
Absolutely.
I keep on saying
local
that
knowledge is so important.
it's so important. So if you see the bats feeding at your bird feeders, pretty good. If you see the bats coming out of houses, that's a good one for the whoever doing fertilizer. Tell us if you see bats coming. You're going on a walk and you see they're coming out of a rock hole. A number of people tell us that when they're doing walks up Red Hills and those places, some of those caves are not documented or rock holes, and entities like NEPA and all of that need this information. So if you're doing a development, because a number of people think you can move a cave and the bats will just go somewhere else. There's so much more work to do. So thank you guys. That's just what I had to share. And Damien will go quiet back again. All right.
Thanks, Damien.
Okay, thanks, Damien. There's a comment from Damani. What about mass insect die-off? We relentlessly spray crops and fog for mosquitoes.
Yeah, that's
I think
also
this is in relation to the climate change issue.
that's definitely also not good for the bats. Yeah, like whether it's bioaccumulation, so they pick up a lot of those toxins from the insects that they eat. They're just being less abundant insects. I know, I've observed that driving around Ontario too. There's just far fewer insects around. So bats have to forage for longer in order to fill up. They have less time for, important social time. There's a whole manner of ways that can negatively impact bats.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that there's lots of ways in which you know, insecticides and things, they say they're safe, and then they give them to you and tell you to use them, and then, you know, 5-10 years down the line, it turns out that maybe they're not so safe. You know, there's like a huge issue with honeybees as well, with colony collapse disorder. For the longest time, it was some mystery, and it turns out that some pesticide company just lied about their tests and it kills bees. So, you know, but it's also hard, you know, it's not as easy to just say like, oh, stop using insecticides for your crops, stop using bug spray, especially in places where there are human health concerns from the insects, you know. So it's complicated. I think they're trying to find natural ways of doing pest management, which bats are a good option. You know, if you can find ways to encourage bats around wherever you are in a healthy way, then I think that can be really helpful. I think Lori Ann disconnected.
Oh, okay. All right.
But the other question in chat is about how likely are they to return from being flushed. And I think it depends on the significance of the disturbance. But in general, not super likely, at least on a short time scale, unfortunately.
Yeah, if it's, you know, a burnt tire or burnt pepper, like Damien was saying, and it's really severe, you probably, if you don't kill the bats, they probably won't come back for quite a long time.
Yeah.
I know that Oxford Cave, I believe, is one that's been used heavily by guano miners, and there's been burning in there and things like that, and there's apparently just no bats.
Yeah.
In contrast, we went to another cave that was quite close to the road, Mount Plenty, which was also it's apparently busy with guano miners, but we went there and we saw some bottles and some guano moving around, but it wasn't clearly a large enough disturbance to really dislodge them, because we still caught a lot of bats.
I think that the main thing is that while there was some signs of disturbance and some trash around, it didn't look like there had been any big burns.
Yeah.
You know, so like in some of the other caves, we had seen red stripe can torches, where it's like someone makes like a kerosene wick torch out of red stripe bottles or something and carries them around through the caves, or they burn a tire or make a big fire pit. And I think that amount of disturbance is really, really devastating for the colony. And like Phil said, if it doesn't kill them, they probably won't come back because of just how substantial that disturbance is. If you go into a cave and you're just loud and obnoxious and you flush them, that's not great, but they probably would come back, I would imagine.
Thank you. Sorry, I got bumped off for a moment there.
No problem.
There are two other questions. Are bats as important as pollinators as bees are? And could caves be rehabilitated after burn?
So yes, they are as important. There are fewer nectar feeding bats around the world. So bees are much more well known and sort of more widely dispersed. There are also many, many more individual bees. But nocturnal bats are one of the most important nocturnal pollinators.
Right.
So flowers that only open at night will predominantly be pollinated by either moths or by bats. So things like durian fruit in Southeast Asia,
Jackfruit,
probably agave,
Bananas.
bananas, agave for tequila,
a lot of columnar cactus, stuff like that.
dragon fruit. Yes, thank you. That was one that I was missing. There are many important crops that we use that are pollinated by bats, and there's also many important keystone species in the forests and the bush that are pollinated by bats. So loss of any pollinator is bad, but yeah, they are as important. And then the other question, sorry, Lauren. Oh wait, hang on. We can see.
Caves be rehabilitated after a burn?
I don't know. I mean, possibly, but the problem isn't necessarily that you've made the habitat unlivable so much as that you've scared away everybody that knows that it's there.
Or killed everybody.
Yeah, you've killed all the bats that know it's there, or you've scared them away and they won't come back. And so it will have to take some time for bats to find it again and colonize it again. So one of the wild things about bats, again, unlike other small mammals like rodents, is that they don't have huge litters. Most bats have one pup a year, which means that they replenish their population very slowly. So anything that takes out a huge chunk of a bat population, it's going to take a really long time to recuperate that loss.
Yeah.
Whereas, like mice have like 3 litters of 9 a year or something like that, they'll explode in population without proper controls. Bats have a much longer generation time. They live a long time, but they only have 1 pup a year, sometimes 2 for some species. And so any die-off events are very, very devastating for the long-term health of those populations.
Okay, thank you. Someone has expressed surprise that jackfruit is pollinated by bats.
I don't know if it is in Jamaica. It likely is by the bigger pteropodid bats in Southeast Asia, where jackfruit is from. I don't know if the bats have figured that one out yet, but they've figured out bananas, which are also not from there. So maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe NEPA can teach the guano gatherers how to safely remove the manure. This is a comment. And then there's a question. There is a lot of community interest in cave tourism. Should this be permitted, or are the risks to people of disease and to the bats of disturbance too great? And I would say perhaps diseases to the bats as well, based on what we heard earlier. So do you think the risks outweigh the possible benefits that human beings would get from cave tourism?
So there are some caves in Jamaica that are kind of, they're show caves. They've sort of been sacrificed to the natural environment, and they have all the pretty lights, and there's a lot of people walking through. So Green Grotto is the one that comes to mind, but it's not that the caves are completely dead inside. Like there's still some bats that are tolerant to people. There's snakes, there's things like that. So it's not that every cave should be visited. Some caves need to be left pristine, especially like the really important ones, but you're not hurting a cave system or the bats inside by going to the entrance and watching an emergence.
Right.
So that certainly should be permitted and encouraged, all that. In terms of disease, there's, yes, like you could track in something from another part of the world, like what happened in Canada and the US with white nose syndrome that we just simply don't know about. Entering caves, you should always clean your boots, clean all your gear, know what you're doing. We encountered some very serious cavers, and they're on top of things. Don't go into a cave if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And risk to people, histoplasmosis would be sort of the big one, but that's not really a concern for Jamaica.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I think that caves are dangerous for lots of reasons, and that there's a risk that comes along with going into caves. There are a lot of show caves in Jamaica. There are a lot of show caves in the States. The parts that are the show part of the cave usually have a lot of lights and stuff and a lot of traffic, and so you're gonna not kill off, but you're gonna cut the bad activity in those areas. But there are probably healthy ways to take a part of the cave and turn part of a cave into a show cave, while you use that money to preserve the rest of the habitat. And I think that that's what's been done at Green Grotto. There's sort of the show cave where it's very touristic, there's lights everywhere, there's people. For a while there was an operating bar inside, it seems. But then they have another place that the public can't get to, that's just absolutely full of bats.
Yeah.
So really it's a matter of how you manage.
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. Oh, someone is saying, how do we hear more from you? Do you have a YouTube channel, or do you have a podcast?
We don't have a YouTube.
No.
Not yet, at least.
He has a podcast.
I do. It's not really my podcast, but I do run a podcast. It has nothing to do with my work.
Okay.
But, I would be stoked if people had questions. You can reach out to me via email or social media.
Yeah.
I'm sure that Damien also, if
Your
he's,
email address and so on in the chat so that person.
Yep, you can throw mine in there.
yeah, I
too.
will. So
And also, just so you know, this as well as other webinars from the Natural History Society of Jamaica, they are posted on our YouTube channel, and it's at Natural History Society Jamaica, no off. You can find us on YouTube and check out our other webinars. And to remind you that this is just part one of the two-part series. Our second part will be led by John Flanders. So we'll get the conservation side of the work that is being done and the research that's being done on bats of Jamaica.
Regarding the question about histoplasmosis, from what I understand from doing some research about this, histoplasmosis is endemic to the US, Canada, and Jamaica, and some other places. If you are from a place where histoplasmosis is endemic, you likely have been exposed at some point in your life in such a way that you maybe got a little sick and didn't notice it, but that you have an immune reaction to it. And that means that you are much less at risk for contracting a severe infection in the future. So a lot of Jamaicans probably, if you grew up around chickens or if you spent any time in caves, things of that nature, you've been exposed to histo, almost certainly, and you're probably resistant to it now. I'm not encouraging reckless behavior, but it's not something that should keep you up at night. However, immigrants from Europe, where there is no histoplasmosis, are at risk, at a greater risk, I'll say, of contracting a severe form of the disease. Also, if you have any reason to be immunocompromised, if you're taking steroids or are also sick for other reasons, that can also drastically increase your risk.
Yeah.
But from going to caves in Jamaica, talking to a bunch of Jamaicans who do this kind of stuff, and non-Jamaican cavers who do this kind of stuff, they don't seem to care about histo. It doesn't seem to bother them. They don't know of a lot of people who have been sick other than tourists.
Yeah.
Particularly from Europe.
For that reason, even though we are from North America, we still wore
We were
masks
wearing our
when we went into
we were
caves.
wearing our masks when we went
Yeah.
into caves, but I think that my risk of contracting histo is worse driving by a chicken farm on my way to work every day here than it ever was in Jamaica.
Okay. So chickens may be a more serious threat to us.
It's a fungal infection that grows in chicken and bat guano rich soil areas. So chicken farms and caves usually.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, it's 8:41. Are there any other questions or comments?
Your crickets.
Yeah, they're just outside there.
Crickets, right? Okay. Phillip and Ronald, thank you so very much. That was a really enjoyable, really interesting presentation and discussion on bats of all things. Not your regular run-of-the-mill animal for conversation. And you have certainly brought them to life for us and really shown us a different side to how we can look at these creatures. So thank you so very much for that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's
thank
been
you
great.
for having us. I hopefully next time we were in Jamaica, we'll be able to do this in person.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Okay, awesome. So we will definitely try to see how we can organize a field trip. We try to do a webinar and have an accompanying field trip as much as possible. So definitely we would want to see what we can plan with you guys and John as well, who's going to do part 2.
Cool.
So everyone who's here, please stay tuned. Watch our YouTube channel. Check us out on social media. I know some of you have joined us by the postings on social media. So thank you also very much once again, and have a good evening, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.